Aloha, welcome to Think Tech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers, interviews with people who have special insights into education from preschool through adult education. I'm Jim Sean, your host. We're live streaming every Wednesday at noon, also posted on YouTube and the Hawaii Educational Policy Center. Our guest today is someone who has spent a lifetime in education, in research, and teaching, international as well as local. Richard Port, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Now, let's just start where I always start, about your education.
Well, I went to school in Chelsea, Massachusetts, which was kind of a blue-collar school system. Actually, I went to a parochial elementary school there. Probably I'd like to think about how that was for me. And specifically, I was, I think, the youngest in my first grade class. And I was more immature than a lot of the students in the school. I think people forget that there's 12 months difference between the oldest and the youngest in a first grade class.
Yes.
And that has potential problems for younger. Doesn't always work that way, but sometimes there is a problem for the youngest people, and I'll get to that on my research later on. Went to eight grades of school there. Then I transferred to a Jesuit high school, and a very good school, by the way. Boston College High School was a prep school for Boston College. Latin, Greek, French, really
a kind of English Oxford approach to education, yes?
Something like Phillips Exeter, which is kind of a famous private school in Massachusetts. But then I went on to Boston College. Halfway through that, I went into the Army because we had a draft at that time. So I spent 2 years.
So what year are we talking about now?
That would have been, well, I went in the Army in 55, towards the end of 1955. And I got out in 57, graduated with my class actually, 4 years in 1960.
What did you major in?
Actually, it was an education major to be a teacher. I think my mother was a frustrated non-teacher. She ended up being a bookkeeper because her dad told her that she had two brothers and she had to go out and work. So in those days, there was a lot of that. You know, you got to earn some money so that we can send your brothers to school. So after the Army. And after graduating, I taught 1 year in Massachusetts in a high school there. And John F. Kennedy was elected, and my wife and I decided to join the Peace Corps. And we spent 2 years in the Peace Corps. Fortunately for me, many of the good schools, Columbia, Harvard, so forth, they were all looking for people who had been Peace Corps volunteers to go into the African Studies program. So,
oh, wait a minute. Where did you go in the Peace Corps?
In Ghana, in West Africa. And when I came back, got a free ride for my master's work, and then went from there. The professor who kind of took a liking to my wife and I, we ended up going to Nigeria for 2 years for Harvard University, opening a brand new school in Nigeria.
That must have been an amazing experience, a school that wasn't there for villages, right from scratch. Right
from scratch. There was an African principal, and my wife and I, the first night we showed up for the first day of the next day of school, and I think that first day there were only 12 students there because it was a brand new school. And so the principal went out into the bush where people had been invited to come to this school, and was able to round up 70 that first year, 140 the second year. It was interesting because some parents were reluctant to let their children go to the high school even though it was their first opportunity in that whole area to go to school, but they were reluctant because, well, in one case, the young lady was the best pottery maker in the village. And this is really a rural area in Ghana where we went, and then in the rural area in Nigeria as well.
So sometimes we forget that we take education for granted. It's just what you do, but not necessarily in a lot of other places in the world, certainly in the 60s. Yes.
And that brings me to one thing that I've learned, and I think when the students ended up going to those two schools, they would be in the classroom like 7 in the morning, or on Saturday and Sunday, they'd be in the classroom Sunday morning studying. I mean, you can imagine the difference between teaching in Massachusetts with a group of high school. Well, I had freshman and junior high school, and it was very different. And so that is one thing that we will talk about later on in terms of differences that we find among students, not just overseas, but among students in America. We'll get to that. But the experience of 4 years teaching in Africa was very profound, actually.
Do you think that your preparation as a teacher in Massachusetts completely changed because of that?
Yes, it did. And I learned a lot about incentive and what drives students to want to learn. And we'll probably talk about that later. But all those experiences, and then I came here, the professor at Columbia University decided to transfer to Hawaii, and he brought both my wife and I and about 4 or 5 other people here to help to develop a new language arts curriculum.
And what year was that?
67, 1967.
Okay.
So it was part of the Elementary Secondary Education Act under Lyndon Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson, and it was part of that society change program that the president had.
So Hawaii was kind of just building its educational brand. The university, the Department of Ed had been there a while, but we were in a building mode.
Well, there were 2 things that were that were and are very different about Hawaii's school system. First was, I think nobody thinks of Hawaii as having a very large school system. We're the 11th largest school system in the country, because all of the schools are under one superintendent. And the second thing, I think, was as it related to the Elementary Secondary Education Act, Hawaii decided to put all its money into the development of a new language arts program. Eventually...
So this was money that flowed out of that federal act.
Correct, $5 million.
And we could have used it. Of course, $5 million sounds
could have been used.
Pittance today.
Well,
but,
yeah, in '67, that was a lot of money.
Yes.
We all do forget that.
Yes.
That, you know, I remember the first salary that I had as a teacher. I think I got. $4,000, I think, was my...
Per year?
Yes. So
in Hawaii?
No.
Oh, in Massachusetts.
Yeah. And that would have been 61. 61.
Yes.
So, you know, things, when you talk money, you have to talk about what era, what time frame. So we were developing curriculum and bringing it as it developed. I think the 4th year, we started in '67. By '70, we had it in pilot schools in each district in Hawaii, on each island.
This was a new
brand new language arts program.
Language arts
primarily peer tutoring with some, you know, this is before computers. Well, before mini computers. We all remember the day of the IBMs and the Remington Rand that would fill up whole rooms.
Yes.
So this was preliminary to that, but we were using something called a language master for articulation of words and phrases. We were using film clips for children to learn to write cursive, which we hardly do anymore. But
that's such a shame that we, you know, that whole cursive writing, my show, I get to tell this, right? Cursive writing is part of developing your identity, because you develop the way you write, and you can kind of compare it to the other kids, and
it's worse than that.
Yeah.
Because I was left-handed.
Oh, wow.
And in those days, my elementary school, we were still using fountain pens. And you can imagine the ink did not dry, smear. I think in 8 years, at that time they had something called Parma method.
Yes,
and, yes.
My mother remembers.
And you got
the entire arm.
Yes. You got a pin,
yeah.
Parma method pin, and a certificate. In 8 years, because of this, and I would stay after school and try. Yes. I got one pin, one certificate.
Okay, well, I'm sure that's on your wall in your living room. Okay, so continue about the. It sounded like you were quite high tech for the time.
For the time we were, absolutely. And in 1970, they decided to go statewide. It was originally going to be 1 year later, but we went statewide in 160 schools, and I was the administrator for that program in 160 schools.
So you were taking it to teachers and saying, let me tell you what you should be doing differently. Oh, you were popular, weren't you?
Oh, I was very popular.
And you didn't have money to hand out, did you?
No.
No.
But actually, I would say of the schools, many of the schools did take on in a realistic way, to the point where Hawaii was implemented in California in a project called the Aloha Project.
In California?
In California. So we were getting some notoriety. And so, in fact, it was San Jose, California. We actually had a school down in Southern California.
So to some extent, Hawaii aspired to be a leader beyond its shores.
Yes.
The guy from Colombia coming here.
Yes.
This must have been an interesting place where people were coming or brought over for a vision and a mission that would be on our shores.
Right. Without getting too far apart, there was also a 4th, 5th, 6th grade program, part of this, that was doing very innovative stuff in the language of advertising, propaganda.
Wow, we need that today, don't we?
Good units that they were developing, showing how propaganda works and how sales are done through the language of advertising.
Yes.
It was quite interesting.
And that would have been a high school unit.
That was from 4 to 6, but the intent was to go into 7th and 12th. And then, of course, as usual, not just Hawaii, but everywhere, there's a gradual decline. You know, we have recessions. 74 recession was a problem, I remember, and from time to time there'd be a problem with money.
So public ed, in spite of its aspirations, is always riding that wave of...
Yeah, education is always part of that, because people look, unfortunately, to saving money, you know, through reductions in education. It's always been a problem.
It's always been a problem. It has to do with salaries. It has to do with all these other initiatives.
Right.
And was the university pretty supportive? You were at the university.
Well, initially, not so much, because you had the College of Education and you had something called CRDG, Curriculum Research and Development Group. And there was some tension between CRDG, which was really very innovative, and then also they also had the terminology of Hawaii Curriculum Center, which is actually the body that I was working for. So there was some tension. Eventually, it kind of worked out better, but my recollection of those early years that there was some tension.
Well, we're exploring educational evolution and research with someone who's been in it all his life. Richard Port will be back in 1 minute.
Aloha! Hello, my name is Patrick Bratton. I'm host of Global Connections here at ThinkTech Hawaii. We broadcast live every Thursday at 1 p.m. We bring Hawaii to the world and the world to Hawaii, talking about international events and various things of interest to the audience. Please join me. I look forward to talking with you and having you get to meet some of my guests. Aloha.
Aloha, my name is Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, and I'm the host of Sustainable Hawaii at thinktechhawaii.com. We air live on the internet and also on Oceanic Channel 16. I'd invite you to come for a fresh new show every Tuesday from 12 to 1 o'clock. I try to bring on guests that give us a different viewpoint on aspects of sustainability in Hawaii, as well as trying to unpack some of the difficult concepts of measuring and achieving sustainability, particularly with regard to sustainable economic growth and prosperity in Hawaii. Please join us every Tuesday from 12 to 1 p.m. Mahalo, aloha.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, Reformers. We're talking with lifelong educator and researcher Richard Port, from Massachusetts to Ghana to Nigeria to Hawaii, doing research at a time when Hawaii aspired to be a leader. Now, talk to me about research and what it takes to be a good researcher.
Well, first, I think I'd like to spend just a minute or so on kind of an introspection of what it is like for every, and I think your audience will understand that every child who comes to school is different in one way or another. Some are younger and older. We talked about that earlier. 1/5 of their lifetime difference between the youngest and the oldest when they go to school.
1/5 of their lifetime. That's an interesting
Right, 20% older, the oldest person in the class, than the youngest. Second thing is, a lot depends on motivation of the parents towards the child. Now, it isn't always a matter of their background. Sometimes parents understand that their background wasn't that great, but they really are driven to have their child do well. Others are, they didn't like school themselves. They can understand why the child may not like school. There's also, among some groups, the idea that if you go off by yourself to study, you're being standoffish, and you are not part of the family or the extended family. And so there's a lot of things that go into how the child accepts schooling and does with schooling. I mentioned earlier myself, the immaturity level sometimes is a factor. Looking back on my own lifetime, I was fairly smart, not the smartest in the class, fairly smart, but I was immature. And I recall all those things. And so in research today, or in the time that I've done research, I find that factors like family background, family education, sometimes you have one of the two spouses that's had a good education in the past, and they have to convince the other partner that that it's important that the children get a good education, that they have books, that they get read to, all of that stuff. And sometimes, of course, children survive on their own. Now, I always think of Abraham Lincoln. Here he was, and not in the best of circumstances, yet he survived, although I understand that some of that is myth.
Oh, shocking, yes.
Yeah, but clearly background, the education of parents, the socioeconomic status of the parents, what they can do for their children. In the last year or so, I go to Kahala Mall a lot to watch movies. And I see all the tables in the middle occupied with either parents tutoring their children, or tutors tutoring tutoring children, or students themselves sitting there with their computers and tutoring each other and helping each other. So it's clear that happens in some places and not in other
Right,
places.
right.
And a lot of it is, you know, if the parents, it doesn't always work, but if the parents have had a college education, it's a step up oftentimes for the youngster, for their child. So the research that I undertook, my job really, technically I was not a researcher, but I loved research. And my background at Columbia University pointed out the importance of doing research in education. So what I did was I studied a group of students that went from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. Every teacher that they had in that period of time, from kindergarten teacher, I looked at the experience of the teachers, well, how many years they taught. I looked at what their degrees were. In those days, by the way, we had teachers in the school system who had only 2 years of college.
So what were you trying to tease out patterns, trends,
Yes,
insights?
Yes. I was looking for what is it that differentiates the students who do well and the students who do not do very well. And it was quite a long study, and when I say long study, I don't mean over 12 years. It was taking a look at the records. I had to get permission to look at the records. In fact, I had to get federal help. Congressman Patsy Mink at that time helped me to be able to show that I was not breaking any privacy laws by looking at the data.
Which is always a real challenge for research, is getting that data,
Getting permission to do the study. It took me probably close to 6 months to get permission to do it. But anyway, I did get permission, and I used one school in every school district in Hawaii. I was on Molokai.
So it wasn't one little class, it was a cohort.
My school on Oahu was Aiea High School, and I went back to the elementary school for those students. I was at Molokai. I was in Honoka'a on the Big Island. Anyway, one school in every school.
So what did you find out?
It was very interesting. The first thing is that it does make a difference, not in every student. I don't want anybody to be misled, but it makes a student, makes a difference in the student's background. That is the family background, and by that we used two measures. One was the education of the parents, and the very interesting, we got the value of the house that they were living in.
The value of the house, yes.
Yeah, and so those two made up a pretty good scale for socioeconomic status. Where it differed sometimes a little bit was in a place like Manoa, where you had a lot of people who didn't have a lot of money, but they had good educational backgrounds.
And if they'd been there a long time, they might have a house that they could not afford today. But
yeah. So anyway, but the first thing was that it was important to know something about their family background. The second thing was this business that we've talked about a couple of times in terms of oldest and youngest in their cohort. If they were the youngest and they were from a poor area, poor socioeconomic background, and if by second grade they were not doing well on tests, the first, generally in those days, I'm not quite sure right now, but in those days the first test a student took in reading and math was in second grade. Those three ingredients made it almost impossible for the student who got to 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade to pass what the test at that time called the Hawaii State Test of Essential Competencies.
Yes.
And it just was remarkable. It was like the third strike.
You could predict, it was very predictable.
Very predictable. Not perfect, but very predictable.
So does that lend oneself to, okay, now let's design an intervention that
absolutely
we go in earlier because we can predict it right now. We know.
Yeah.
You know.
And in fact, you know, there've been some attempts at that preschool programs, and I have not tried measuring the difference. That would be an interesting study.
Yes.
And even at my age, I'd be willing to do that
Yes.
if somebody was interested in
Well,
doing
the kind of data that rolls around is the number of vocabulary words you know. And there are some kids who are, you know, they may know 5,000 words and the others know 25,000.
Yeah, that's
That
right.
must be an enormous advantage or disadvantage.
Very much so.
Mm-hmm.
So the the patent was very clear that in those kind of circumstances, it really would have benefited some of these students to have started school, formal education, maybe a lot more preschool, but formal education a year later. Now, I understand Punahou has a sort of a system that
Well, a lot of the private schools, when my son was on the soccer team, many of his same age, you know, teammates were a year behind because they were going to private schools and they were held back, particularly their boys. You know, the psychologists all said, "You're a boy and you're young, you're repeating," or whatever. And so he was.
My inclination is to be at least somewhat supportive.
Yes.
I mean, there may be reasons why a parent says, "No, I don't agree with that." But to some extent, I think it would have paid off a little better for me, as well as I ended up doing. And by the way, that pattern of immaturity was also true for me in high school. Maybe not so much in college, but in high school.
So you were always somewhat behind in intellectual, emotional,
social emotional kind of. I would say more than academic. I was pretty bright actually, not the brightest, but fairly bright, but always I think a bit immature. And
now in any of these, was there any dynamic as to the size of the school, as opposed to getting lost in the crowd?
Yeah, we looked for that, and I don't think we did a good job of studying that. I think there is a difference. My belief systems tells me that there is.
Now, fast forward many years later, when I was at the Educational Policy Center for the first time, we did a study for the legislature, figure out what's different between our state and others. And we had teachers said we had all this data in different categories. The one thing that stuck out is that Hawaii's elementary, middle, and high school, on average, were twice the size of enrollments. It was the one outlier compared to mainland schools or mainland states and the ones who did very well.
I was shocked when I first went to the Department of Education at how large August Aron's school was. It's a huge school. I don't remember the numbers anymore, but for an elementary school to be that size, I don't.
We liked big, you know, and there were debates about that.
I think there is such a thing maybe as too small, but for example, suppose you have two children in a school in the same grade. Not so good. Generally, schools should have at least two tiers. You know, two kindergarten, two first grade, so that you can have twins, and even if you happen to have brother and sister or something that are not twins, but they were less than a year apart. So there is a minimum, I think. I don't believe in really small schools. I don't believe in the one-room schoolhouse. Although the program that we were developing, which was called the Hawaii English Program, or HEP for short, had kindergarten, first, second, third graders in the same class. Not necessarily brothers and sisters. In fact, generally not brothers and sisters. And sometimes the oldest kids were teaching the younger children, and sometimes the younger children were teaching the older ones. So I'm pretty good with that idea of that concept of peer. The person who was in charge, I guess I should stop long enough to say, the person who was in charge of our program was a Professor Gerald Dykstra. And Gerald Dykstra, to my belief, even today, was the only true genius that I've ever known.
Okay, we will explore genius and the ideal school as Richard Port sees it after our 1-minute break. Be back in a minute.
Okay, this is Think Tech Hawaii, and it's Wednesday. Every Wednesday is Energy Wednesday here in Hawaii, the state of clean energy. 4 to 5 p.m. every Wednesday. Come and listen to us. And just to show you what I mean, I'm going to ask Sharon to tell us more.
Come and see us every Wednesday, as Jay said. And we have people like Jim Albers from HECO here and co-host Ray Starling here every Wednesday. We not only go on Olelo and OC16, but also stream live. So please come visit us, hear about the latest in clean energy.
Okay, Jim, you've been here. You got any comment on all this?
As important as energy is in all of our lives today, this is a great forum and a great format to vet those issues. So I encourage everybody to listen in and participate.
Okay, Ray, what do you think for a close?
Well, I think this is the greatest show in the energy world here in Hawaii. You can come here every week, 1 hour, and catch the latest on what's happening and hear from the people who really know what's going on, like Jim Alberts. We appreciate your coming today.
Thank you.
Ray Starling, Sharon Moriwaki, Jim Alberts, and Jay Fidel here in Hawaii, the state of clean energy. 4 to 5 p.m. Wednesday. Aloha.
Aloha.
Welcome back to Think Tech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, Reformers with Richard Port. He was about to tell us about the only genius he's really met.
Well, Dr. Dykstra, who had been at Columbia University, I think surprised me at least that he had decided to come to the University of Hawaii. And he was enticed here for 2 reasons. His wife liked Hawaii, had been to Hawaii.
That helps.
So that helped. And second, I think being placed in charge of a multi-million-dollar project for somebody who's been mostly the theoretical, but here was the opportunity on the practical side. And the one thing I would really look at, he really believed in this peer teaching. And in other words, instead of the teacher doing all the talk and the students sitting,
Yes.
The way the program was set up was very much individualized. And as I said just before the break, that sometimes the younger children were teaching the older children. And so it was very innovative in that way. And I think it led me to look at schools in a somewhat different way, classrooms in somewhat of a different way, as though I was somebody from another planet looking down on a school and seeing 2 different types of school. One where the desks are all faced to the teacher, and the teacher does all the
factory,
yeah. And that model is, of course, fortunately because of computers nowadays, that model is becoming less prominent, and people do interact certainly somewhat more than they used to. In the old days, the only interaction might be in the science classes.
Right, right. So here's this chunk of money. We're giving it to you.
Yeah.
Design the school with everything you know. What would it look like?
Well, I think certainly technology would play a major role. I think, in fact, I know you'll appreciate this. Nowadays, teachers can do their own research on what's working in the school system. In the early days when I came here, a lot of the introduction into what was going on in other states came from the educational specialist at the state level or the district level.
Here's what we know, you do it.
And yeah, it might not be that bad, but almost that bad.
Yes.
It might be, here's what's working in such and such a city, and here's what, but internet now is, teachers who are really interested can find out what's working anywhere. So I would say that the first thing is no more desk-facing teacher. Well, I just can't imagine.
Okay, so the classroom would be set up differently.
Absolutely.
What about the size of the school?
I would prefer schools that were tending to be smaller, but not too small.
So what, 400 or 500 or something?
I would say maybe 600-700 would be okay,
Yeah.
but above 700 probably not so good.
And what about the curriculum? Right now we tend to decide you're successful or not if your kids do well on 2 tests.
Yeah.
But what about, you know, the arts and music
Well,
and all this?
I'm glad you brought that up because, and we may be heading as a reaction to testing. We may be heading back to a more normal way of the way it, in some ways, the way it used to be. Art and music are very important, and the only reason that, well, the major reason that we focus on English and math is because it's a little easier to test those.
Yes, it's for us and not for them.
Right. In fact, on one extreme, music and art teachers cause a little bit of their own problem because they say, well, you just can't test. But you can observe. You can do an observational test.
Well, actually, in an interesting way, how do you get to be in the band? You audition.
Yes.
How do you get to be on the football team? You audition.
That's right.
You know.
That's right.
And when we think about what adults do, we tend not to apply that in a real world way.
Yeah, that's true. I think that we've got to hopefully come back to a more holistic curriculum, because sometimes it's doing well in art and music that leads young people to want to do good in
That's right.
arts
That's right.
or-
And knowing that role models are important, it may be the music role model, or the art role
absolutely.
model, or the film editing role model. I know for me, my older cousins were in music, and that always gave me a pathway.
In the later stages, before I retired from the Department of Education, I worked there 25 years. Before I retired, one of the interesting happenings was the department, when it would lose money, when money would be cut by the legislature or whatever, they would drop music specialists, both at the district and the state level.
Yes.
How terrible! You know, how short-sighted. Now, even in those areas, a lot of the research can be done. Certainly, music nowadays is so available that.
Well, yes, and there have been studies that if you're involved with instrumental music over many years, as a variable, you tend to do better in all the other academics.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And we're just learning how the brain works.
Yeah.
Jazz musicians are using so many parts of their brain at the same time.
Well, basically, language and music are symbolic systems.
Yes.
And like math too. All these are symbolic systems. So clearly, it's very helpful to be involved in a more humanistic kind of, holistic kind of education.
Now, we do know that many students, well, the school day is kind of short, you know, 2:30, 3 o'clock, goodbye. Particularly if they're living in a community where there may be crime, troubles, whatever. The length of that school day must be relevant too. Is that something you would address with after school or whatever?
First of all, in general, I agree with the concept of having after-school programs. I mean, there's no question about that. I did not formally study that because a lot of that had happened just about the time I was retiring. I will say I recall Congresswoman, at that time Congresswoman Mazie Hirono was very active in after-school kind of funding.
And Governor Cayetano pushed the A+ program.
Right. And so I'm, totally for that. Especially, it's probably more important in poorer communities.
Yes. What do we think they're doing?
Because otherwise, the children go home and they're not studying. They're not at Kahala Mall with their tutor.
They may be at Kahala Mall, but not
running from store to store. But yeah, so that is a clearly important factor in education.
And I guess one of the challenges is that the kind of wraparound supports that we often acknowledge are needed for that child's full life are not delivered through the education system. They're delivered through other silos in our bureaucracy, departments.
That was another aspect of work that I did do. There's a difference between schooling and education. Schooling is what a student gets 5 days a week, 7 or 8 hours a day. Education is what you get from 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And that concept should be in the back of a mind of any superintendent, any, you know, in legislature, because there's the clear difference between what you learn in school and what you get from an education. You know, I like to say sometimes the parent who can maybe once a year take their child to the mainland and maybe even go halfway across the country, Mississippi River. I mean, you know, what the child learns from that is part of their, not just their schooling, but education. Or the person who gets to go to Alaska, and you know, up there are many different terms for snow.
Yes.
It's not just snow. It's not even just snow and sleet.
Yes.
There's all kinds of words that are used in the language for snow. So I think that we don't take adequate account of that. There is some good news because educational TV is broader, and because there is the understanding of what we learn from video, and that things are much better than they were 10, 20 years ago as far as children in Hawaii, even if they don't travel.
Yes.
But traveling is better.
Yeah, traveling is better, which we've had a complication with the ethics people over what that was.
I was in shock, state of shock, because the teachers who go on these trips, they work really hard.
Yes.
It's a scary, they know that they are responsible 24 hours a day for the students' behavior.
And you know, as a profession in teaching, this notion that we are not appreciated, respected, you hear this coming from the teacher, and along comes this ethics group who says, let's assume you might be corrupt, you know, which is not a good message. It's not a good policy. I think it will be fixed somehow.
Yeah, I think they will fix it, but it should have been fixed almost immediately.
That's right.
You know, I'm very pro-ethics commission, but that was a way out kind of ruling.
So we have a not too big school, a different kind of classroom, a broader curriculum, after school engagement, hopefully by a majority of students, but other things as well that would support learning and education in the broader sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that, I think, is, you know, schooling is thought of mostly as subject matter.
Yes.
But there's the interactions that go on.
The human
element.
I admire this teacher. He inspires me. Everybody has one adult out there that, wow, if I hadn't read this hallowed ground in the 8th grade, I would never have.
I think every student remembers one or two teachers who really helped them. Mine was my 1st grade and my 3rd grade teacher that I remember. And I can imagine my 1st grade teacher, knowing that I've already admitted being somewhat immature in 1st grade. That teacher must have done a lot to be able to handle me well enough to be able to move on to learn.
Well, we've been talking with Richard Port about his lifetime witness to education and research and what's good, where we should be going, and ending with a reminder that in the end, people are involved. And it is that interaction that is very, very important. Thank you very much for being on Think Tech Hawaii.
Thank you.
Aloha.